Welcome to Talking Money, episode 19. Delighted to welcome Hannah back for another conversation about three topical money subjects this week, things we've spotted in the personal finance press. And we're starting with a fascinating report published this week by the Resolution Foundation. It's called the UK's Decisive Decade. And they're really looking at the combination of five big seismic changes to UK society and the UK economy, all coming to fruition during the 2020s. And I guess being quite critical of the government for its absence of any economic strategy. Let me rattle off what those five are quickly and we'll dive into each of them. But they think coming together during this decade are the aftermath of COVID, Brexit, the net zero transition, so moving to carbon neutrality, an older and aging population, and rapid technological change. So, five big themes, and any one of those in isolation, Hannah, I guess, would have a sizable impact on the economy. But bring all five together, and that's quite a big deal.
I think actually the report makes exactly that point. They sort of say, you know what, any country at any time coming out of a pandemic or dealing with a huge restructuring in how it deals with international trade or even massively trying to reduce its tariffs, those are by themselves just huge isolated
Mm.
subjects that are complicated long-term strategies from government, which this government, and to be fair, most governments are not very good at, which we can come on to a bit more later. But it looks like, I mean, I would really encourage people actually to read this report, because if you're remotely interested in kind of economics and how it affects social structure and what's been going on and how these things all link together, this report is really honestly interesting reading.
Mm.
um the first major topic is obviously coronavirus, and they talk about a lot of what we've touched on actually, and probably what a lot of people will be able to see in their day-to-day lives. And so two of the main themes are the changing of working patterns and what that means. So people spending more time working from home, which might be a good thing for leveling up the country. On one
Mm.
hand, you don't have to, for instance, live in London if you want a professional job anymore. um, it could also mean that businesses move around as well. There's more going on in local areas. On the other hand, it might mean that lower earners have to find new jobs because cities suddenly aren't as prosperous as what they were. So there's a lot going on there. And there's also the issue of, sorry, I'm trying to find it. I've lost it all in my notes now. The rapid decline of the high street, which I know you and I have
Yeah.
discussed at length, but of course, coronavirus has led to everybody shopping online. And so I suppose it's trying to shift that in a direction that is as least damaging as possible. And this report talks on and on and on about equality. And it is damning. It's absolutely damning. Again, if you're not a fan of this government, I really suggest that you read this report, because it is scathing about the
Mm.
last decade and how we have been so unproductive and we are actually going backwards compared to a lot of other nations. And it's a phenomenal read if you're not into the Tories, trust me. So that's the first major point. Um, and then Brexit, which again, another huge, this is massive. No other country's ever
Mm.
done this before, and we're just going to have to do this alongside all these other massive
At the same
changes.
time as going through the other stuff, absolutely. And I think I've said to you before, it's going to be very difficult from an economic perspective to separate out the impacts of Brexit with the impacts of recovering from coronavirus, and of course, as they say here, the impacts of making a transition to net zero, the aging population, rapid technological change. These are all huge factors. What I quite liked about, I liked lots of things about the report. What I particularly liked about the report was their balance, and they did point out some of the positives. So pre-pandemic, we had record levels of employment. We were in a fairly good situation, I think, economically, but obviously the pandemic has knocked that for six, and coming out of it along with these other seismic changes, it's a real challenge. But they are very critical about the government and talking about almost an absent economic strategy. Lots of buzzwords, and we hear about build back better and levelling up and all these sort of government buzzwords, but very few actual solid plans. And I guess that was confirmed in the Queen's speech last week as well. There wasn't really much about the economy, and we've been very, I guess, very reactive to what happened in the last year or so through COVID in terms of our economic response. But there's very little in the way of a proactive strategy for how do we actually achieve things. Carbon neutral, getting to net zero is a big one for me. great ambition, and we're going to talk about a story later on this as well, but fantastic ambition, really, really good goals, but not a single hint of a plan for how we're going to get there.
I think as well, I mean, yeah, I mean, we will talk about this a bit later, so without meaning to give away everything in total, but we are still so far from net zero, even though there is a few things in place. So, listed companies, for instance, have a lot more regulatory boxes that they have to tick, if you like, because they're agreed to certain stuff that forces them to lower their carbon footprint. But there was a really interesting stat in here. So in order to reach net zero by 2050, we need to move from installing almost zero heat pipes each year to installing 3,000 every single day by 2030.
So
And you
these
just
these
think
are these
about,
are
oh,
domestic heating heat pumps, aren't heat pump systems or heat source systems. So instead of your gas boiler, which obviously pollutes the planet and the rest of it, this is about ground heat source and replacing it as a heating source. And you're right, we're not installing any effectively at the moment.
no, I mean, just think about the infrastructure challenge that
Yeah.
could present to be practically installing 3,000 of these things every single day. It it's mind blowing. I'm really interested as well in technology. Um, this is another sector that's going on. We're experiencing loads of digitization. Again, that links with the pandemic, that we're all spending a lot more time online and finding that we
Mm.
can work virtually. Um, the downside, of course, is that automation could mean mass job losses. And there are possible upsides to that if we could find a way to be productive about those job losses, or maybe a bit of a kinder economy, and find a way where we are less obsessed with working all the time and more obsessed with finding pleasure and joy and allowing robots to do the work for us, which is kind of how I hope that things go. But that's a very, very idealistic way of looking at things. The reality is that we might see an awful lot of job losses. I think that there's a figure here: 1 in 7 jobs could disappear as a result of
Mm.
automation in the next 15 to 20 years. And that's scary. That's
Mm.
really scary.
Especially for the types of jobs and the types of sectors that are likely to be hardest hit by AI and automation. And this is a complete segue into a different story. But we heard this week they're planning to do a universal basic income trial in Wales. And we don't have the details yet of that, and sort of which region it's going to cover and how much the base level is going to be set at. But in my head, at least, one solution to automation taking jobs is going to be universal basic income. And perhaps the pandemic and furlough was a bit of a front runner to those sorts of schemes. We've seen experiments in different countries, but perhaps it just prepped the ground a little bit and made us used to this idea that we'd receive money to stay at home and to be a productive member of society, but not going out to work every day. And like you, I'm quite happy if a robot wants to come and take my job and pay me to go kayaking and swimming and walking in the country with the dogs and the rest of it. Bring it on, I say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree. But just to get serious for one last second, I mean, the point about this report, and this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier when I was saying that it worries me a little bit, because I do recognize when I read this that these are issues that we need to deal with. And the report essentially makes the point that if we don't do this, we are at risk of a prolonged era of relative decline.
Mm.
And then you're talking slow growth, you're talking high inequality, badly handled economic disruption that undermines well-being. It's going to intensify social divisions. It's going to create political problems. Arguably, we've already seen some of that in the last few years. I think this country is probably more divided on issues than I have been aware of it. It's hard for me to talk about being a child, but certainly in my adult lifetime. And the report makes the point that you can almost listen to these points and go, right, we need to restructure really how we do things in the economy, and we need to think big and think in a new way about this, or we risk kind of poodling along and just really losing out compared to our neighbors. So we're underperforming, for instance, France and Germany now,
Mm.
and that will only get worse. And so if people do believe in Britain and they want us to be this kind of force for good in the world and really have a place in the world that is dominated at the moment by the US and China and the European Union, these are big, big blocks to try to compete with when you're ultimately a little island. I think this is really, really, really worth thinking about. But the cynic in me thinks it won't happen because politicians of all walks of life actually are always focused on short-termism, because
Yeah.
that is how you win votes. And unfortunately, that seems to be the goal of politicians these days, rather than actually wanting to do any good for society.
Well, look, I'm going to finish this one, Hannah, with a call to action, which is please go out, find a copy of this report. It's readily available. Put it in the show notes as well, a link to it. Read the report and then write to your MP and flag up some of these issues, because at the end of the day, they represent us. And, if there's enough push towards that to say we need an economic strategy that addresses these big themes, then hopefully somebody in power will take action and we won't be left behind. So we need a proper plan. I think that's the conclusion of that one.